एनकैम्पमेंट के चौथे दिन में आज के लेक्चर में आप सबका स्वागत है। आज का लेक्चर हमारे सीपीएस के सेंटर फॉर पॉलिटिकल स्टडीज के प्रोफेसर फैकल्टी आमिर अली सर हमारा लेक्चर आज लेंगे और आज का टॉपिक है कैंपस अनरेस्ट सिमुलेटेड और रियल। और ज्यादा ना बोलते हुए मैं सर से रिक्वेस्ट करूंगी कि कैंपस अनरेस्ट सिमुलेटेड और रियल हमारे आज के टॉपिक पे हमारा लेक्चर शुरू करें।
Okay, thank you for asking me to give this talk today. आप लोग फरमाइश करते मैं मना नहीं कर पाता हूँ। And I've got this written down. I don't know if I might need to keep consulting it. You see, what's been happening is I've been speaking too much, and I become a little wary when I speak too much because things get a little muddled in my mind. So if I get muddled up, I'll take recourse to this. But some of you have said, please don't read out from this. It becomes very boring, mechanical, and robotic. I'll try not to. Okay, I'll try my best not to do that. But if I do have to, please bear with me. Keeping in mind, I am quite a motor mouth in terms of speaking. Yesterday, today, tomorrow, so many of these speaking engagements. Where do I begin? I mean, but my talk is built around this distinction of simulated or real. I'll try to explain what that means. और मैं अंग्रेजी के अलावा जो और दो बाकी ज़बान जानता हूँ, तीन ही ज़बान जानता हूँ मैं, अंग्रेजी, उर्दू और हिंदी जानता हूँ. I wish I knew more languages. मैं उन languages में भी इन बातों को explain करूँगा. मैं शुरुआत करना चाहता हूँ इस बात से कि अनरेस्ट शुरू कहाँ से होता है, कैंपस में अनरेस्ट क्यों होता है. And I'll say this in English first, and then I'll explain this in Hindustani, हिंदी उर्दू की जो आमेजिश है, जो समन्वय है, जो मैं बोलता हूँ आमतौर पे. So I think that I would, my feeling, my sense is that it arises from a certain discontent within the classroom. It's when the classroom starts shrinking. When in the classroom you can't say what you want to say, when there's a certain kind of a narrowing of the walls, when the lecturer is afraid that what he or she is saying may actually be recorded and put on social media, जो लोगों को करना नहीं चाहिए, that is when the classroom starts shrinking in a very adverse sort of a way. This, to my mind, represents a certain kind of a shrinking of the university space beginning from the classroom, which in many ways is the basic unit of the university. I mean, of course, university में बहुत कुछ होता है, examinations होते हैं, seminars होते हैं, public talks होते हैं, but there's something very fundamental about the unit that we call the classroom. And it is from that fundamental unit of the classroom that I want to link this idea of unrest. Okay? Now, as the discussion progresses, I will try to make this distinction between simulated and real and what I mean by it. But that is for later. Now, when Aditi and Daud, you came and asked me to give this talk, I'm always a little reluctant at the beginning, and then you prevail upon me, you persuade me, and I can't say no. And I think this is important because somewhere मुझे लगता है कि this is an old professor of mine, Imtiaz Ahmed at CPS, would always tell me, he would say कि जब students के हैं तो मना मत करना. And I feel bad if for whatever reason I'm not able to give a talk. So most of the time I try to आप लोगों की बात मानने की कोशिश करता हूँ as much as is possible, because I mean it's for university, the students at universities are created. But Aditi, I think you specifically asked me to talk about 1960s and 1968, which I will try to do. There are certain historical reference points जिनके basis पर मैं unrest की बात करने की कोशिश करूँगा. और ऑफ कोर्स जो आपने गाजा के बारे में कहा है कि रिसेंट जो अनरेस्ट हुआ है, एंड आई थिंक इट्स वेरी सिग्निफिकेंट. आप स्टूडेंट्स ये मत समझिए कि आपका बोलना माने नहीं रखता है. ऐसा लगता है कि मतलब नहीं है, ऐसा लगता है कि अनरेस्ट या लोगों के जो एहतजाज है, जो प्रोटेस्ट है, इट इज मीनिंगलेस. बट इफ यू लुक बैक एट हिस्ट्री, यू विल नोटिस दैट क्वाइट ऑफन हिस्ट्री हैज बीन ऑन द साइड ऑफ द स्टूडेंट. Administrations crack down on students, they will do all kinds of things to make student lives difficult, but in the larger scheme of things, the larger sweep of history, one does realize that these student protests do have a certain kind of a resonance, of a certain kind of a bearing, a certain kind of they do tend to influence the course of events. So I want to begin with this point. Okay, why does the student have to leave the classroom in the first class? Out of bounds है ना lecture series का नाम. ऐसा होता क्यों है? I mean, why does this ये situation, ये जो नौबत आती क्यों है? कि the student has to leave the classroom, come out onto the streets of the campus, in the green spaces of the campus. And I think it's important to reflect on why this happens. Because obviously there's a certain dysfunctionality that is setting in at what I referred to as the most basic and fundamental level of the university. अगर आप यूनिवर्सिटी को ऑर्गेनिज्म की तरह सोचें, एक ऑर्गेनिज्म होता है, एक जिंदा ऑर्गेनिज्म, उसका सबसे बुनियादी बेसिक जो यूनिट सेल होता है. उसी तरह से मैं इस एनालॉजी को यूज कर रहा हूं कि क्लासरूम शायद सबसे बुनियादी, सबसे बेसिक यूनिट होता है ना. उस यूनिट पर अगर एक सर्टेन काइंड ऑफ डिसफंक्शनैलिटी आ जाए तो जाहिर सी बात है कि वो पूरे ऑर्गेनिज्म में फैल जाएगी. सो आई डू वांट टू फोकस ऑन व्हाट आई एम रेफरिंग टू एज द डिसफंक्शनैलिटी ऑफ द क्लासरूम. और इसके 2-3 रीजंस होते हैं और अफसोस के साथ कहना पड़ता है कि वेल दिस इज अ कॉम्प्लीमेंट टू स्टूडेंट्स कि स्टूडेंट्स आर नॉट रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर दिस. नाउ आई एम नॉट सेइंग दिस टू प्लीज यू. I'm not saying कि अच्छा आपने बुलाया मुझे इसलिए I have to say nice things about you. Whenever a university declines, the decline of that university is not because of students. It happens because of an indifferent faculty. It happens because of an administration. हमारे ज़माने में I remember Pink Palace as it's called. JNU Prashasan लिखा हुआ है. Someone had got up and painted "Save before Prashasan" and from in between, so it became "Save JNU from Prashasan." So that was of course our student days, 1990s, when there was a new Pink Palace that had just come out. But I do want to stress this particular point. I mean, we are witnessing the slow demise, well in this case this university, a very quick demise of this university. And my point is that it doesn't have to do with the students at all. Now, jahan tak mujhe nazar aa raha, when I'm looking at all of you, what I'm looking at is a certain urge, a desire for people to come and lecture to them, to teach them, to talk to them. This is a teaching. I will also, in the course of this discussion, try to dwell upon the historical significance of the teaching during the 1960s. But to come back to the point, when I'm looking at you, obviously there's a demand. ऐसा नहीं कि students पढ़ना नहीं चाह रहे हैं. उनकी ख्वाहिश है, उनके अंदर तलब है. जो उर्दू वर्ड है स्टूडेंट के लिए वो तालिब इल्म, जिसको इल्म की तलब हो. And I can see that. Now the point is, अगर classroom की dysfunctionality is setting in, let us explore the causes for that. So I'll begin with a broad hypothesis. Okay? What is that? That the student is compelled to come out of the classroom and onto the streets when the classroom itself is not compelling enough. Okay? That's the reason. Simple reason है. अगर क्लासरूम में बातें समझाई जाएं इस तरह से कि लोगों को समझ में आ रहा हो, मुश्किल चीजों को आसान तरह से समझाने की कोशिश की जाए, तो कोई वजह नहीं है कि स्टूडेंट क्लासरूम नहीं जाना चाहे. And it is because of this reason कि इस यूनिवर्सिटी में हमेशा हम लोगों ने अटेंडेंस की मुखालिफत की है. Okay, it doesn't look nice in this university if we enforce attendance on students to make them come to class. So the point I'm making is that, in other words, when students cannot find anything worthwhile in the classroom, when the lecture is too damn boring, as quite often my lectures do tend to be, and I try to make up for it, they will want to leave the classroom. However, if they are forced and arm twisted into coming to the classroom, as they often are, on account of that horrible thing जिसको हम लोग attendance बोलते हैं, compulsory attendance. एक ज़माने में यहाँ पर काफ़ी उसको enforce करने की कोशिश की, much before all of you came to campus, I think. Then this marking of attendance, they will come and mark their presence, but it will be an absent presence. I've seen it quite often in class. I look at students वो मौजूद हैं physically वहाँ पर, but their mind is elsewhere. And I think this has to do with the way in which pedagogy operates, the unimaginative ways in which teaching is done, the unimaginative nature of curriculum. So there are a lot of reasons, but I want to focus on, this dysfunctionality of the classroom dying. Now, if the classroom dies, that means that that's a threat to the rest of the organism. That the university is the analogy of the organism that I'm using here. So, why does the classroom die? Okay. And I want to suggest some of the following things, reasons why that happens. एक वजह हो सकती है कि जो लेक्चर देने वाला हो इतने बोरिंग अंदाज से लेक्चर दे रहा हो कि हर आदमी सो रहा हो. अक्सर होता है. I hope that doesn't happen too often. It happens. I can't say that it doesn't happen. But I do want to recall the words of a book that you will perhaps be familiar with, the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Now, what does he say? He says that when there is in the classroom a narration sickness, okay, narration, इसको हम लोग कहते हैं बयान, और एक होता है लोगों का अंदाज़े बयान, किस तरह से वो बात अपनी रखते हैं. कुछ लोगों का अंदाज़े बयान बहुत अच्छा होता है. इसी शहर के गालिब एक शायर थे, लोग कहते थे गालिब के बारे में, हैं और भी दुनिया में सुखनवर बहुत अच्छे, कहते हैं गालिब का अंदाज़े बयान. और सो नरेशन सिकनेस, is one reason why the classroom becomes, and these are Paulo Freire's words. He suggests that the teacher talks about reality as if it were motionless, static, compartmentalized, and predictable. Or else he expounds on a topic completely alien to the existential experience of the students. Freire suggests that students are seen as receptacles and containers to be sufficiently filled in by the teacher. Okay? That's the boring, mechanical, drab, dull way in which it is done. Now, let's try to focus on this point. Now, I think that we are in agreement here that there's something wrong when classrooms do not resonate with students and the concerns of students. And that's exactly what Freire is trying to suggest here. Okay, that is one of the first reasons why you have what I'm referring to as the death of the classroom. And it is on this basis that I will talk about the unrest that will then spread to the rest of the university in terms of the organism that I'm trying to understand the university is. एक वजह ये हो सकती है कि टीचर ने डिवाइस ही नहीं किया हो करिकुलम, जो कि आजकल हो रहा है with new education policy. You're handed down a curriculum which you just have to just kind of dish out. And as Freire suggests, you just think of students as receptacles, or worse, as consumers these days. Now, think of the travesty of the situation. If you actually think of students as consumers, that means that there's something awfully wrong in the way that teaching is even conceptualized and thought of. I'll give you a more familiar reason why the classroom is dying. You'll be familiar with this one. This has to do with teachers. The classroom dies when the faculty member is too busy publishing. Okay? Now, I can't blame poor faculty members because the way that the modern academy has developed, the only thing that matters is an inane sort of publishing. Okay, you keep on rehashing things. It's very unfortunate that the university and academia, modern academia, has developed in this direction because to my mind, this represents a certain lack of engagement with the classroom. Because whatever you write must stem from a certain immediate engagement with what is happening in the classroom. Now, this is to do with the way that the university has developed, the way that faculty performance is only gauged on the basis of how much someone is publishing, how frequently he's publishing, in which journals he's publishing, and I think it's particularly pernicious to academia. So I fear that this publish or perish culture of cutthroat competition in the modern university is also contributing its fair share to the death of the classroom. Questions must be raised over this veritable publishing industry that profits from the carcass of the classroom. Carcass कहते हैं कुछ चीज़ मर जाती है. And when I look at predatory publishing, heard of the phenomenon? Must have heard about it, when people basically pay to get published. Ajib auri baat hai. I should try it actually. It might help me in my promotion. Sorry, I keep cracking jokes about that. By no means am I against academics and scholars writing. जरूर लिखना चाहिए academics को. दिल खोल के लिखना चाहिए. और खास के ऐसे वक्त पे लिखना चाहिए academics. ये जरूरत है इस वक्त. But the problem is that I am against the way writing is wrangled out of academics today for the sake of promotion and tenure. Academics should write, academics must write, but they can only write when there is something on their minds. Unfortunately, the publishing industry has been encouraged by modern academia, makes writing and publishing like a hamster wheel or a treadmill. They can't hamster wheel. Okay? Those little cute chuha type animals. And they keep going around on this. That's what academics have become. You know, they keep going faster on this kind of academic hamster wheel or treadmill, call it what, if you feel that treadmill is more respectable. Aajkal gym jana is more fashionable ho gaya hai. Call that. But the point is that there's a certain inanity that is being built into this process. And in the way that I'm trying to understand this, it is contributing what I'm calling its fair share to this kind of a death of the vibrancy of the classroom. The fact that the classroom should be bubbling with ideas. So let me add as a side that as we are watching, and I often make this point, and I keep making this point because I think it's important, that as we are watching a whole global order change, it is imperative that some of us bear witness, gawahi dein, to this changing world order. How do we do it? One of the ways that we do it is through this particular exercise that we are doing right now, and I'll come to the significance, the historical significance of the teach-in in a little while. I come back to the question, how do we bear witness? Okay, what does it mean to bear witness? It means that I was there. I saw this happening. Now, one of the most enduring ways to do it is, of course, to write. Now, I fear that the publishing industry prevents precisely that from happening. What it is encouraging is a particular inane kind of writing, where there is a certain kind of ineffectiveness in the writing that people are engaging in. So, I view writing, and please let me know what you think about this, especially Q&A, when I'm sure that you will have many, many questions and contestations over things that I say. But I view writing in the nature of an effulgence. An effulgence means something that spontaneously, it effuses outwards, and that it forces itself out to act as a testament to the starkness of the times that we live in and through. And I can't stop myself from quoting these glowing lines of Faiz. I'm going to say this in Urdu first, one of my favorite lines, and then I'm going to translate this in English. Translation meri hai, to zarur uski daad dijiyega aap log. Okay, so I'll say this in Urdu first. हम परवरिशे लोहो कलम करते रहेंगे, जो दिल पे गुजरती है रकम करते रहेंगे, असबाबे गमे इश्क बहम करते रहेंगे, वीरानी दौरा पे कर्म करते रहेंगे. I look at writing in the spirit of these lines of Faiz. Now let me explain this for the sake of people who do not understand slightly high-flown Urdu, and this is something I've translated myself. We must keep plying the pen on the tablet of fate. Laho Qalam is the tablet of fate. Faithfully recording what befalls our woe-begotten hearts, the sad reasons for our love and forlorn loss, even as we tirelessly redeem the barrenness of our woeful times. If there is one thing the university can do, is to act as a sentinel in terms of the ravaging of these barren times that we live in, the anti-intellectualism, the sheer crassness, the hatred that we see all around us. The university must be a sanitary, a kind of an oasis of sanity in terms of everything that we are witnessing around us, the Trumps of the world and all the others of the world who are making this, the kind of political environment that is so pernicious to Tagore's famous lines where the head can be held up high. So let me come back to the point about classrooms, not reflecting the state of the wider world, okay? I want to emphasize this point a little more. A certain disconnect between what is being said and taught in the classroom and what is actually happening in the world, all right? I go back to the year 2011 when I was still a young assistant professor at CPS, where I now am continue as a very old assistant professor. Okay, so the year is 2011, okay? आप लोग स्कूल में रहे होंगे इस वक्त, right? So the financial crisis had hit the world pretty bad. Thankfully, we were saved of the particularly bad effects of this because the Reserve Bank of India in those days still had a certain autonomy, which I don't think it has these days. Okay? Now, I read about a group of, or set of 3 economic students at the University of Manchester in England. Okay? What did they do? They asked their professors, I'm sure you ask your professors this question, do ask them questions. सवाल नहीं पूछेंगे तो क्या खाक फायदा teaching का? So they asked their professors how their lectures seemed to have no resonance with the financial crisis that was wreaking havoc with people's lives. Now, what was happening, especially in Western countries? People were losing their houses. It all began with the subprime mortgage crisis. The people had taken loans, they couldn't pay back those loans, and their houses that they lived in were subject to foreclosure. Now, that's very tragic. I mean, if the house that you live in is being denied to you, that means aap sadak par aa rahe hain na? Now, these students were worried about this. They asked their professors, how is this happening? What you are teaching us seems to have absolutely no bearing whatsoever in terms of what is going on in the world. So the 3 students, I'll tell you their names, Joe Earl, Cahal Moran, and Zach Ward Perkins, went on to write a book called The Econocracy. Okay? Econocracy. Where they write that the biggest economic crisis of our times wasn't mentioned in our lectures. And what we were learning didn't seem to have any relevance to understanding it. They go on to say, we were memorizing and regurgitating abstract economic models for multiple choice questions. आप लोग वैसे हैं शायद? Multiple choice. Anyway, we teach you enough critical thinking to kind of overcome that. But this is the whole point of the university. What is the point of a classroom? The point of a classroom is to promote a particular critical thinking. And what universities, especially the most marketable departments, and economics happens to be one of the most marketable departments, have done, is to talk about, in this particular repetitive, regurgitative fashion, about abstract models that seem to have no connection with what is going on in society. That would be what I'm referring to as classroom dying. So, in other words, the classroom dies when we have rote learning, which is the biggest killer of critical thinking. And we can see the classroom dying as there is a veritable vigil on thinking. In the sterling words of a JNU colleague of mine, "Soch pe pehra hota hai." Soch pe pehra. And you can see that happening. I mean, people self-censoring. Ye bol sakte hain, ye nahi bol sakte hain. Now, obviously, if you have a situation of this kind, where there are clear boundaries set of what you can say, what you can't say, what you have to say edgeways, what you have to kind of skirt around, that means that you will have a certain kind of unrest on the campus, beginning from the classroom itself. So what does JNU teach you? Before I say that, I'm going to tell you a story. That might make it a little interesting. But before I come to the story. So I think that when the classroom dies, along with it dies democracy as well. Okay, it's a point that Professor Avijit Pathak, one of the best teachers in JNU, some of you may have heard of him, some of you may have heard him talk. But he made this point somewhere in one of the numerous articles that he wrote, that somewhere democracy is linked to the classroom. And when you have the death of the classroom, also the demise of democracy, which we are witnessing all around us today. So that is why at JNU, when many of us insist that when we walk in, you do not stand up. I've seen this, especially first semester students, we call, because that's the way they do. And we say, no, we don't do that here. Now that is a particular culture that we intend to continue and perpetuate. Because that is the way in which you can have this kind of an exchange that I'm talking about. That is why we insist that you ask questions, that we will try our level best to answer. And when we don't have the answers, we come back the next day with the answers to your searching questions. So what does JNU teach you? Okay, let's come to this. What does the JNU classroom teach you? What does the teaching teach you? What do the numerous public lectures that happen teach you? So let me share with you what it taught me when I came to this campus as a student 3 decades ago. I came to this campus in 1996, long time ago, right? Before many of you would have been born. Okay, and that old dinosaurs were still roaming all over this place. So I'll tell you a story. Back in those days, there were no malls opposite JNU West Gate. Okay, seen those shiny glitzy malls? Ambience and so on and so forth. But we did have the Priya complex at Vasant Vihar. It was the coolest place to hang out from our standards in those days. It had the Priya cinema where we would go and watch movies, and it had McDonald's, which had just opened its first outlet in that. The McDonald's that you see is the first outlet of McDonald's in this country. I remember the date as well. I'm good with dates. History ratna kaam aata hai kabhi kabhi. It was the 24th of October 1996. Now, towards the end of that year, under my first semester as a master's student at CPS, India Today carried an article on JNU where it claimed, this is the quote from the article, "Idealism is out, individualism is in." Okay? Idealism is out, individualism is in. Marxism is fading, and everything is changing at the Kremlin on the Yamuna, as JNU was referred to. This article by the journalist Vijay Jang Thapa, in its 30th November 1996 issue, mentioned how if you walked a few hundred meters away from the Priya complex, you would come to the bright red brick buildings of the JNU campus, nestled amongst the greenery of the Delhi Ridge, which is a continuation of the Aravalis. And it also made this point that the M of McDonald's, which you can still see, would challenge the M of Marx, and that the M of the market would challenge the M of Marx here at JNU. So it is McDonald's and the market versus Marxism. So again, I come back to this point, what did it teach me? It has taught me that the market has failed multiple times over. And proponents of the market keep arguing that the solution to failed markets is even more markets. And that's what Albert Einstein, I think, insanity. It's doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Okay? Now there are vociferous pro-market proponents. There may be many in the faculty, and it would be good to have a debate, but unfortunately it doesn't happen here. We just keep talking to the same kind of people. It's like talking to the already converted, preaching to the already converted. But anyway. So the market seems to be something that fails upwards. This is a point that the South African comedian Trevor Noah jokes about. He says that the white man is the only person who can fail upwards. So the market similarly fails upwards. The more it fails, the more successful the damn thing becomes. So Trevor Noah's joke was about the white man being the only one who fails upwards. Noah was referring to Christopher Columbus, and his failed attempt to get to India by sailing the wrong side around the world. He failed, but he failed upwards. Columbus has failed so brilliantly upwards that my favorite politician in the world, Donald Trump, is now planning to install a statue of Columbus in the White House. Now think of the sensibilities that this will really disturb. Okay, this failing upwards is now resulting in a statue. Now Trump is another instance of a white man who can fail upwards. And Noah's point is that when you and me fail, we fall and we get right back up again. That's what I was always taught. Okay? You fall, seen a baby walk, toddlers, it's very cute to watch them. They will walk tentatively, they'll fall down on their bottoms and they'll get up again. But they never give up. So that's us failing. The white man, of course, has a different kind of a privilege. And do you know what they call it? This failing upwards? Take a guess. What do you think they call it? Any guesses of what this particular failing upwards is called? Good one. You know what they call it? Merit. You see what merit means? It is a privileged standard that a privileged set of people set for themselves and say, oh, we are able to overcome this. हम लोग सबसे meritorious हैं. The meritocracy is created by this particular thing. So this is kind of a failing upwards that creates this idea of a merit. So JNU taught me how much of an elite construct the word merit is. I had no clue. I would use that word. I came here on my merit. Okay, you may have passed the JNU entrance exam, but you may have come with many, many privileges. And this is the first lesson the JNU taught me. And this is why this is a university I respect so much, in which I am in many ways privileged to serve as a faculty member. I've been here for a long time. I hope to stay here for a considerable amount of time, hopefully. You never know these days. So let me also add that I've stopped going to McDonald's as well. And that this happened, my decision happened a long time ago. And the resolve in my decision was further reinforced when it was discovered that the McDonald's Israel franchise, Alon Yal Limited, was supplying free meals to Israeli soldiers in October 2023 at the beginning of Israel's genocide in Gaza, which Aditi you mentioned, and of course I have some more to say about that. So the death of the classroom is deliberate. There's nothing natural about this death. You know, when you have a particular kind of a natural death, log jawan hain, boodhe hote hain, and then the body starts to decay. That's a natural death. The death of the university is a very, very deliberate act. It is done by appointing the most uninspiring faculty members, not because of a lack of talent, but because of certain political decisions. It's as simple as that. So the death of the classroom, and by extension of the university, does not mean that no classes are held, or the other routine paraphernalia of the university, like conducting exams and holding seminars, do not happen. Such events happen. They happen sporadically. But they happen when, in a dull, lifeless, and soulless sort of a way, with the lecturer droning on and the student wishing that the misery ends. The student is held to ransom in classrooms and seminars by the requirement of attendance and the big brother eye of the professor watching. That's why you go to seminars, right? Because we're looking at you. Let's admit, let's be very honest about the whole thing. So what dies along with the classroom is what we call pedagogy. I remember I talked about Paulo Freire's book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. One of the most important ways in which a dominant ideology is extended and perpetuated is something that I have realized in the course that I teach in CPS, political theory, in which a set of established and canonical texts, very inaccessible, very difficult to understand, are to be discussed in the classroom. The remoteness and inaccessibility of these texts, remember Freire's point? What is he saying? That the life experiences of the students do not coincide with what is being taught. And it is no wonder if the student is looking so bored and so depressed and so upset with what is going on. And it's something I have realized over the years, and I can't say that I've been able to do much. I try my best and I fail, although I don't fail upwards. Only white men can fail upwards. So to kind of dwell upon this point about political theory, which I teach in the classroom. So a set of established and canonical texts are to be discussed in the classroom. The remoteness and inaccessibility of these texts, the often impenetrable language of the commentaries that quite often add to the confusion clouding the main text in the first place, are difficulties. I've struggled with this, I must admit. And the elephant in the room is English. One of the major reasons why this particular alienation in the classroom is happening is because of the English language, which is a language of privilege in this country. when it doesn't have to be a language of privilege. Now, what is the solution to this? To this kind of discontent within the classroom that then stems outwards towards the rest of the university and creates the unrest that I'm talking about. Now, the solution is not to revile English. There are certain politicians who will say, Sharman Lagi, you take your guess who I'm talking about, that there will be people who will feel ashamed of speaking English. That is not the solution. This particular reviling of English, this idea that it has to be trashed, I think is very, very unfortunate. But it's important to embrace it democratically, imperfectly, and without insisting on correct pronunciations and proper enunciations. It can be spoken in a certain, and I hope you get the reference to what I'm talking about here, correct pronunciations and proper enunciations. I will not elaborate any more than that. My point is that the classroom must open windows to the world in an animated, exciting sort of a way. And it must not shut them. And I fear that the current mood of indigeneity and Indian knowledge systems that we see pervading university campuses is doing precisely that. It is shutting these windows to the world, which classrooms are meant to open. And again, I go back to my favorite target these days, post-colonial theory and decoloniality, which I feel have done so much to encourage this particular mood of indigeneity in Indian universities right now. Now, this may also be a good point to reflect on the physical state of the run-down classroom in the public university. I mean, look at these buildings. This is atrocious. This should not be the case. Obviously, I don't know where the maintenance money for this is going. You never know when a chunk of plaster might fall on you, and that's the end of you. Okay, and you contrast this with the gleamy, glitzy, shining nature of the private universities, some of which I've been to, and I must say I can't say I've been impressed by them, but I must say I felt very envious of them. Okay, you get to this kind of infrastructure, and you know what I'm talking about. I mean, I don't have to elaborate on this too much. So, what this reflects is that I think that over the years, the public university, and a privileged public university like JNU, has witnessed a very steady secession of the privileged. Where do they go? They go to the Ashokas and the OP Jindals and the other fancy places that are mushrooming around Delhi and other major cities. It's unfortunate because a classroom must be a class mixing institution, and also for this country, a caste mixing institution. That's where you learn. So it is the passing away of that JNU that I lament the most, where a student from the most far-flung province of the country could have the confidence to feel that there was nothing that would in any way, he or she was in no way less than the student from the most elite college like St. Stephen's or whatever other elite colleges we have in this country. This was the leveling ground. This was the great leveler that JNU was for me. This was the big eye-opener. That, this is the world that JNU opened up to me. The realization that there are people from all parts of the country, from all kinds of backgrounds. And JNU was a great leveler. It brought everyone on a certain level of parity. And as I said a little while ago, it is the passing away of that JNU that I lament the most, and which I try to do my utmost to resist. JNU never was a bastion of elitism. It was never Oxford, it was never Harvard. Okay, we should never be under that impression that it was these places. But JNU did provide the possibility of upward mobility for many. In other words, it created the possibility of a sensitive and sympathetic elite that was nurtured and fostered here. It rose from the ranks. A sensitive and sympathetic elite is one that climbs up a ladder, and then not just leaves that ladder in place for others to climb up, but also points the way. Ye rasta hai. What we see today, by contrast, is a degenerate elite that climbs up the ladder and then condescendingly, sneeringly, and cruelly kicks that ladder away to remind ourselves of that very evocative title by the South Korean economist Ha Jun Chang. Kicking the... So you get the point? There are two kinds of elites. You can have a sensitive elite that climbs the ladder and keeps the ladder in place for other people and points out, ye rasta. What we see amongst the Indian elite, which I think is one of the most despicable elites in the world, I mean, the Epstein files has revealed to you how despicable. There are no words in the English language to describe the despicability of this global elite. But the point is that what makes the elite particularly pernicious is this particular manner of sneering at people below and saying, I am here, you are there, you can never get to where I am. Now that's my point about JNU as an institution. This is what it could give people. It allowed them this particular possibility of upward mobility. And as I said, this is something that I really bewail. So I've made all these points. Let me come to the 1960s, which is what Aditi really asked me to talk about. I took a long time to come to this. This is why I wanted to read out. All those of you who said, "Padhiye mat," I tend to ramble, right? Okay. Now, the point of the 60s is that this is a decade before I was born. Okay, I'm old, but not that old. Okay. But there are two books that I have read which have kind of framed that decade in my imagination. Why was it so significant? It was significant because of unrest on campuses. Now, the argument that I'm going to make in this talk is that the unrest of the 60s was a simulated kind of unrest. What we are witnessing today is a far more real kind of unrest, and you are the bearers of this real unrest on campus. So do you get the point? I hope I can explain. I'm just being nice to you. But once again, I'm trying to explain the crux on which this lecture is based. It's based on a distinction between the protest of the 60s, which I'm suggesting was simulated, okay, not the real thing. Okay, बच्चों को नहीं गाड़ी पे घुमा देते हैं, हाँ बहुत अच्छा बेटा तुमने बहुत अच्छा किया. Okay, that was simulated. I'll try to explain why I think it was simulated. I may lose a lot of friends because of this. Now, as I said, the two books that I have in particular formed an impression of a decade that I've heard about so much. One is Tariq Ali's Street Fighting Years, an autobiography of the 60s. Give it to you. What are they? Okay, very good. Alright, and the other is Mike Marcuse's biography of the legendary boxer Muhammad Ali. Redemption Song, Muhammad Ali and the Spirit of the 60s. Okay, these are the two books that have given me a certain kind of access to understand what that decade and what I'm referring to as its simulated campus protest was all about. Now, campuses in the West in those days, in the 60s, were in rebellion against the US and its imperial war in Vietnam. We all know that bit of history, right? The draft call was expanded. Now, this is important. As the Vietnam War intensified, and this meant that Muhammad Ali, at the height of his boxing career, 24 years of age at that time, was also called up for the draft. Okay, this is the story. 24 years old, at the height of his boxing career, one of the most charismatic sports persons that I have seen in my life. Now, Ali blurted out, not me, Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali blurted out the line that made him the legend he was to become. The line was, "Man, I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong. Why should I fight a war for US imperialists?" Now this line, the point that I made about this line is that this line is really the line that makes Ali the legend that he is. His embodiment of the spirit of the 60s was preceded in the spring of 1965, when anti-war, and this becomes important in the context of what we're doing, anti-war teachings were held at more than 100 universities across the US. Marcuse in his biography of Muhammad Ali notes that the teaching was a variation of the sit-in. You know, like our dharma, the sit-in? So the teaching being a variation of the sit-in, the tactic popularized by black students in the South in its early days, many of the activists in the nascent anti-war movement were veterans of the civil rights movement, and they infused the gathering anti-war protests with its language and its methods. The point of the teaching then is that the classroom has become a space too constricted to contain the vastness of the issues that need to be talked about. That's when campus unrest happens. If there are issues that are so big that they demand the attention of students outside the immediate confines and requirements of the classroom, that's when a teaching happens, as it is happening right now. Okay, this is where the idea of the teaching begins in 1965, in the spring of 1965. When a teaching of this kind happens, it indicates that the unrest on campus is seeking an outlet. Not merely in the confines of classrooms, but in the green expanses of campuses and out on the streets. There is something real and genuine about this kind of unrest, which is born of the zest, the earnestness, and the enthusiasm of youth. And what can be more creative and imaginative than the earnestness and zest of the young? In March 1968, 3 years after this, you had the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. Okay, absolute cover-up by the Washington establishment. The story of this massacre and the cover-up was broken by the American journalist Seymour Hersh. Many of you may have heard of him. Recently, on the recommendation of one of my students, I watched a Netflix documentary on the life and work of Seymour Hersh. And what struck me at the end was his explanation of what makes him stick to and tick in his work. The interviewer asked him the question, what makes you pursue these stories to their logical conclusion? And this is what he had to say. Okay. He said that the things that are going on, and you just cannot keep quiet in the face of these horrendous acts. That's what I see when I see this unrest on campus. I see a certain concern among students. Okay, there are things going on, you cannot remain complicit, you cannot be silent, you have to speak out. And one of the ways to do that is, of course, to organize as many of these activities as you can, because as I told you a little while ago, the classroom is not allowing this to happen. Now, I have made this point earlier, and I would like to take this occasion to make this point again today. It is about the entwinement of the ethical with the political, and the rejection of the idea that politics is a devious activity engaged in by Machiavellian princes of darkness. That's a standard understanding of politics that most people think, oh, this is the way that it happens. It's not the way that it happens. It doesn't have to be this way. It can be made better. And there is a certain optimism there, despite all my pessimism, which many of my students will be very familiar with. So it is about standing up and saying no to injustice. Wherever in the world and to whomever in the world it is being done, it is about a phrase that I've used a number of times now. It is about commending the right and condemning the wrong. It's as simple as that. Now, I want to make one last point about the campus unrest of the 1960s, and then I'll come to the more recent campus unrest over Gaza. Now, it was youthful, it was idealistic, it was romantic, it was lyrical, and it was brilliant in every conceivable way that I have read about it and thought about it. It was all of that. Yet it was limited. And hence my point about the fact that it may have been simulated. It was limited by the fact that the university campus back in the 1960s was perhaps a small and confined bastion of privilege. Not everyone got to go to university. I haven't checked the gross enrollment ratio, but I'm pretty sure that in the US, in the West, and in India, the gross enrollment ratio would have been very low. This is why I'm calling it a simulated revolution. Very few, and the privileged went to university. As I said, I say perhaps because I have a feeling that the gross enrollment ratio would have been very low. In the West, it would have been white and middle class, very few blacks, very few Latinos, which continues to be the case today. In India, it would have been upper caste and upper middle class. JNU was only established in 1969, that's the fag end of the 1960s. It would have been interesting to do a counterfactual experiment, thought experiment. What it would have been like if JNU had been around in the 60s to witness that decade. Perhaps you should write a novel, or I'll write a novel on this. Okay, doing that thought experiment. Now, the point about the limited nature of 1960 student unrest was brought home to me in a conversation that I had with someone who almost snortingly suggested that it may have been great at the time, but it ultimately turned out to be some bourgeois kids enjoying the thrills of a simulated revolution before they were co-opted by the changing and transitioning nature of capitalism in the 1970s. And those of you who read your David Harvey will know that the 1970s was a decade in which capitalism transitioned from its Keynesian underpinnings to a post-Fordist, post-Keynesian order. Now, it is from this conversation that I get the idea of a simulated campus protest. Now, I don't know if that is too harsh a judgment, but I do want to suggest that the university since the 1970s across the world has become a different kind of an entity. Like any entity, it will change. The university that JNU is today was not the JNU that I came to in 1996. The JNU that people came to in the 1970s was not the university that JNU became in the 1980s. It is the nature of any dynamic organism to continue to change and evolve in different sort of ways. And most importantly, I hope JNU will be able to show that resilience in terms of the pressure that it is experiencing. I hope it can bounce back. I hope it will. I'm sure it will. So it is on this basis of this that I want to come to more contemporary instances of campus unrest. Notably the Gaza encampments that have proliferated across many universities across the world as a horrified response to the Israeli genocide in Gaza. Let me add as an aside that even though notionally there has been a ceasefire in place since October 2025, the genocide continues. Upwards of 600 people have been killed in Gaza since the notional ceasefire has been put in place. And in the West Bank, the Israelis continue their clampdown in terms of grabbing Palestinian land. The other thing that I've noticed is that Israelis have now stopped denying the Gaza Health Ministry official figures of something like 71,000 people being killed in Gaza since October 2023. Now, there's something very quickly that I want to mention before I come to Gaza. There's a bit of a in-between point that I want to make about the 1970s. Okay, this is to do with something that I read about universities in Egypt, in the Middle East. Now, I read an article in the journal Daedalus, which is pretty famous. It was called Islam and the Revolt of the Petty Bourgeoisie. Now, the point that the article made was that larger numbers of youngsters in the 1970s from far-flung provinces were streaming into the universities in the 1970s. Okay, this is the way the university is changing across the world. Enrollment ratios, enrollment numbers are going up, which is a good thing. That's something that we have always tried to make university education as accessible as possible to as many number of people. Now, what happened with this streaming of large numbers of people coming to the universities, especially in a big city like Cairo, is that these universities, these youngsters had hoped that passage through the portals of the university would act like a passport to better jobs and better life standards than was enjoyed by their parents. That's the hope that many of these youngsters had. Now, unfortunately, these hoped-for benefits did not materialize to the extent that they had hoped for. So, university campuses and the unrest that they contained within them because of these unfulfilled aspirations became the recruiting ground, and a very fertile recruiting ground, for right-wing Islamist organizations. Now, you see how right-wing organizations kind of prey upon a certain discontent. Now, the point about especially the right-wing Islamist organizations that I've been looking at is that they in many ways are against the very idea of the university itself, because there are strictures laid down about what you can talk about and what you can't talk about. I'm very familiar with that, what is going on here. So, the better way to recall what exactly is the functioning of the university is to recall something that I first read when I came here. It struck me, Nehru's idea that the university is an adventure of ideas. And I thought, oh, that's exactly what a young person would like. And it's precisely this pressure on the university that I see. This attempt to thwart the possibility of this adventure of ideas from taking place. So, let me come back to the whole Gaza issue. This was a bit of an aside. I kind of wanted to fill that gap. I talked until the 60s about what's happening in the West, 70s, and let me come to the recent Gaza encampment issue. It's unfortunate, and I say this with a lot of sadness, that Indian universities did not express the level and intensity of opposition that was to be found in many universities across the world. Columbia did become the epicenter of these protests. I can't really go into the reasons why our universities did not resonate on an issue that many feel has become the moral hinge on which the global order will change in the 21st century. And I strongly feel that we are witnessing the birth, and we're going through the throes of a new world order coming into existence. And I think one of the very important moral hinges on which this world order will kind of transform itself will be the issue of Gaza. But again, in terms of the basis of my argument today, I don't want to differentiate these recent protests with the 1960s anti-war protests to suggest that today's youngsters are far less likely to be co-opted in the capitalist system. Okay, so when I talk about the simulated 1960s, my point is that those youngsters, when they left university, were co-opted by a transforming capitalist system. Today, that possibility is not there, and in that basis, I think that the unrest that we see today is likely to be a far more real one rather than a simulated one. I hope I've been able to put that point across as clearly as I possibly can. So there are at least 2 points that emerge from this point that I'm making. The first is to do with the sheer vehemence and violence with which the encampments were suppressed. I remember reading a very detailed account of the violence at the University of California at Los Angeles. And the one thing that this reminded me was the violence that was meted out on this very campus in January 2020. It was very similar if you read the accounts. So this is really what the unrest of the campus is up against. A certain kind of a forceful, violent crackdown against it. What becomes most clear is that free speech in general, and on university campuses in particular, is nothing more than a superficial liberal ruse to be accepted and tom-tommed when convenient, and to be discarded when it raises uncomfortable questions about the establishment. Let me give you an example of this. For me, in my growing up years, I've described this man as my alter ego. Salman Rushdie became an embodiment of free speech. Okay, that was me. Like 13, 14 years old, satanic verses happened. And I said, oh God, we Muslims have a free speech problem. Yeah, we have a free speech problem. We do. Okay, but that doesn't mean that the liberal West does not have a free speech problem. Rushdie would have been an enthusiastic, long-haired, young student protester during his days of simulated campus unrest at Cambridge in the 1960s. That's why he went to university. In fact, in one of his novels, I think it's Satanic Verses, there's an account of student protests when amid the familiar sloganeering of Ho, Ho, Ho Chi Minh, we shall fight, we shall win, very familiar in those campuses, one of the characters in the novel climbs onto the British Prime Minister's car and starts protesting the pro-American stance of the British government. Okay, this is the simulated 1960s campus unrest that I was talking about. Now, Rushdie has exuberantly celebrated that simulated unrest. I mean, for many of these oldies, they reminisce about those times. Okay, they will talk about how exciting it was. But I come back to my point, which is that more recently, it came to the real unrest of campuses on the Gaza issue. I did notice Rushdie became particularly mealy-mouthed when he was asked in an interview in May 2024. If you don't believe me, go Google it, watch it on YouTube. He became mealy-mouthed about the question of free speech in the wake of the disruption of the Gaza campus. That would reinforce my point about the stimulated as against the real nature of campus protests and the hope that today's protests, today's unrest, does not suffer the fate of the simulated one. The nature of the violence unleashed on universities is a reflection of the second point I want to make about the manner in which over the last 5 decades there's been a process of the neoliberalization of the university. Now, the neoliberalization of the university seeks to make the campus a sanitized, safe space for subjects and disciplines that easily follow the dictates of the market. It is here that the humanities and the social sciences and the basic sciences are the biggest sufferers. The proponents of the market make the point that there is no demand for these subjects, and this becomes a pretext to cut down on funding, faculty recruitments, and fees. So I'm going to try to conclude my talk. As I try to conclude this talk, I want to go back to the M dogs. Remember? It's still there. Okay? Came up in 1996. Thought personal, you know. A lot of things become a little personal for me. That M and the M that we were taught here. So I've seen that bright yellow M. It's still there. I have seen how its emanating glow and its market forces move towards the bright red brick structures of JNU. JNU has indeed been significantly damaged. For that matter, which aspect of the delicate warp and weft of society has not been damaged by the unleashed and out of control market? Many of my students will know that I'm a great admirer of Karl Polanyi's celebrated 1944 book, The Great Transformation. Polanyi, wearing his hat as an economic historian, shows the fiction behind the idea of the self-regulating market. There's no such thing. Okay, it's one of those fiction of some people's imaginations. We must read history to know the twists and turns that it will take. Universities have become transformed into businesses, veritable real estate and hedge fund enterprises, to which the idea of university has been attached as an afterthought and as an add-on. That is how Columbia University was described to me in an article that I remember reading. That is how university administrations seek to counter and curtail the real unrest of students on campus. I urge students to read a 1918 book by the Norwegian-American economist Thorsten Veblen. It's called The Higher Learning in America, a memorandum on the conduct of universities by businessmen. Remarkable book to read. It's been over 100 years since it was written. The book should serve as a warning not to privatize higher education and aggravate the already deep and chasmic inequalities that have driven societies to the point of tearing them apart. Now, as I indicated somewhere at the beginning of this lecture, I believe that the university must act as witness to the tumult of the times that we live in. And the teaching would always be an example of that. Such an act of witnessing must take into account the fermented real unrest of the campus. Rashid Khalidi, the Palestinian historian who taught at Columbia and recently retired, told his students outside the gates of the university, he told them that you're on the right side of history. And that certainly university administrators will be on the wrong side of history. So the right side of history, how do we identify it? It tends to be the side of the bread that is not buttered. Okay? The side of the bread, makhanbazi, not buttered. A little unfortunately, I would hazard to suggest that the youngsters of the simulated campus unrest of the 1960s may have fallen for the buttered side as they were co-opted by the capitalist establishment of their countries. We must learn from the lessons of history. In today's real unrest on campus, youngsters must choose and choose carefully. As there is a 21st century, the first quarter of which we have seen unfold, it has elapsed and must be redeemed from its inequality, its warmongering, its fearmongering, and its authoritarianism. For the sake of what? Why do we have campus unrest? It is for the sake of justice, for humanity, and for decency. That is what makes it real, not simulated. I'll stop there.